Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. If you're into history, you're in the right place, and especially if you're getting ready for those UPSC exams, this one's for you.
Absolutely.
Today, we're diving deep into a pivotal moment in India's fight for independence, the Cripps mission of 1942.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one, full of twists and turns.
So much intrigue.
Lots to unpack.
Definitely. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss out on any of our future deep dives. All right, let's set the scene. It's 1942, the world is in the thick of World War II, and India, under British rule, is suddenly a key player in this whole global conflict. But the relationship between Britain and India, well, let's just say it was complicated.
That's putting it mildly. The fall of Singapore and Rangoon to Japan had just rocked the British Empire.
Yeah, huge blow.
The threat of a Japanese invasion of India was very real at that point.
Looming large.
And Britain knew they desperately needed India on their side.
Not just on their side, but fully committed.
Exactly. They needed resources, manpower, the whole nine yards. This wasn't just about ideology anymore. It was about survival.
Stakes were high. So that's where the Cripps mission comes in, right?
Precisely. Enter Stafford Cripps, a British politician sent to India with what seemed like a pretty generous offer, a pathway to something called Dominion status after the war.
Dominion status? Sounds kind of familiar, like Canada or Australia.
Yeah, along those lines. It was basically Churchill's government's last-ditch attempt to secure India's support in the war effort.
A last-ditch effort. Okay, but I'm sensing there's more to this Dominion status than meets the eye.
Oh, there's always more to the story. And for those of you out there prepping for the UPSC, this is where those analytical skills really come in handy.
Good point.
The Cripps mission wasn't just a reaction to the war, it was also a response to the growing force of Indian nationalism.
Which had been building for decades.
Absolutely. The demand for independence was reaching a boiling point.
Things were heating up.
And the failure of the August offer back in 1940, the one that promised Dominion status, but with very limited self-governance that had left Indian leaders feeling deeply disillusioned.
Yeah, that was a major setback.
And then you have the individual satyagraha movement, a limited but powerful campaign of civil disobedience led by Gandhi.
Now, for anyone who's not familiar with this period, the individual satyagraha might need a bit of context.
Sure. It was actually a brilliant strategy by Gandhi. Instead of massive protests, he had individuals chosen to offer satyagraha nonviolent resistance against British rule.
Smart move.
It kept the movement alive, maintained the pressure on the British, and avoided those huge disruptions that the British could easily use as an excuse for a crackdown.
A calculated approach. So we've got this pressure cooker situation of World War II, raging Indian nationalism on the rise, and the British caught between their imperial ambitions and this changing world order.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And we can't forget the global context here, especially for our UPSC folks. The United States was emerging as a major power, and even China, then fighting its own war against Japan, was urging Britain to find some kind of solution with India.
Wow. So much happening on the world stage.
But Churchill, he was stubbornly resistant to the idea of giving India full independence.
Holding on tight to that empire.
Well.
So with all this tension simmering, Cripps arrives in India with his proposal.
A pivotal moment.
Did the British honestly believe this would work, or was it all just a clever tactic to buy some time?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something historians are still debating to this day. Was the Cripps mission a sincere attempt at compromise, or was it just a shrewd political play?
To really understand this, we need to take a closer look at the proposals themselves.
Look at it.
All right, so let's break down these Cripps mission proposals. They were a bit of a mixed bag, offering some concessions, but with some pretty significant strings attached.
Classic British strategy. Right. On the surface, it seemed like a step towards self-governance. They proposed setting up a constituent assembly to draft a new constitution for India.
Okay, so giving Indians a voice in shaping their own future.
Exactly. That was the idea. But there was a catch. The members of this assembly wouldn't be directly elected by the people, they'd be chosen by the provincial assemblies.
So an extra layer of separation from the people they were supposed to represent.
Precisely. And that raised concerns about whether it would truly be a representative body.
Right, because it's not like everyone had a say in who was in those provincial assemblies either.
Exactly. And this indirect method of election, well, it raised doubts about the true democratic nature of this whole constituent assembly idea.
So a step forward, but with a definite British twist.
You could say that. Then there was the big one, the offer of Dominion status for India after the war.
We talked about this a bit earlier, like Canada and Australia, right?
Yep, the same idea.
Yeah.
Basically, it meant India would have control over its domestic affairs, but things like defense and foreign policy would still be under British control.
So partial autonomy, but not full independence.
Exactly. And for our UPSC aspirants out there, it's really important to understand the nuances of Dominion status. It offered a degree of self-governance, but it didn't grant full sovereignty.
Right, because ultimately the British Crown still held the final say.
Exactly. And that was a major sticking point for many Indian leaders. They wanted complete freedom, not just a partial break from British rule.
Makes sense. And didn't you mention earlier that this Dominion status came with another controversial element?
Oh, yeah, I almost forgot about that. This was a big one. The proposals also included a clause that gave provinces the right to secede from the Indian Union?
Wait, hold on. So they're offering this path to a unified India, but also giving provinces the option to just break away.
Yep, that was the idea. The British saw it as a way to appease the Muslim League, which at that time was pushing hard for a separate Muslim state.
But wouldn't that have just led to more division and chaos?
It definitely had the potential to, and that's exactly what many people, including some within the Congress Party, feared. They saw it as a classic British tactic of divide and rule, weakening the independence movement by sowing seeds of discord.
It's like they were giving with one hand and taking away with the other.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The inclusion of this secession clause became a major point of contention. It raised anxieties among those who envisioned a unified and independent India.
It's not exactly a recipe for unity and harmony.
Not at all. And that brings us to the reactions from different Indian political groups because, let me tell you, they were not thrilled with these proposals.
Okay, so the stage is set. We've got World War II, raging Indian nationalism on the rise, and then these Cripps mission proposals land on the table, Dominion status, a constituent assembly with limitations, and that controversial right to secede. I can only imagine the response.
Oh, yeah, it was not a good reception. Let's put it that way.
So let's start with Gandhi. I know he had a pretty memorable way of expressing his disappointment with the whole thing.
Oh, yeah, Gandhi, he didn't hold back. He famously called the Cripps mission proposals a post-dated check on a failing bank.
Wow, that's harsh, but also kind of brilliant.
Right. It perfectly captured the sentiment of a lot of Indians at the time. They saw the British offer as empty, insincere, lacking any real commitment to actually giving India independence.
Yeah, like a promise that might never be kept.
Exactly. And for our UPSC listeners out there, analyzing statements like this from key historical figures is super important. Gandhi wasn't just being poetic. He was making a strategic point.
Right, he was highlighting the lack of trust that had built up over years of broken promises and unfulfilled expectations.
Exactly. He believed that by delaying the transfer of power until after the war, the British were basically giving themselves a way out. They might not even be in a position to honor that promise once the war was over.
So it was a rejection of the entire premise of the mission, not just the specific details.
Precisely. It was a fundamental disagreement over the timeline and the sincerity of the British intentions.
Okay, so Gandhi was not impressed. What about the Congress Party? How did they respond?
Well, the Congress Working Committee, they debated it for a while, but ultimately they officially rejected the Cripps proposals too.
Not surprising, given Gandhi's stance.
Their main demand was pretty simple. They wanted complete and immediate independence. No more delays, no more half measures.
Full Swaraj.
Exactly. They saw Dominion status as a way for the British to hold on to power while pretending to give concessions. It wasn't enough.
And what about the Muslim League? Did the whole secession clause appeal to them, given their goal of a separate Muslim state?
It's interesting. At first, they seemed kind of intrigued by the idea, but in the end, they found the proposals too vague. They wanted a clear and absolute guarantee of a separate Muslim state, something the Cripps mission just didn't provide.
So once again, trying to please everyone ends up pleasing no one.
Exactly. The mission failed to bridge that fundamental gap between British imperial interests and the Indian desire for complete freedom.
And this failure wasn't just a diplomatic setback. It had a ripple effect, right? It kind of fueled the fire of the independence movement even more.
Absolutely. The Cripps mission, while a failure in its immediate objective, actually became a turning point in India's struggle for independence.
Interesting. How so?
It strengthened the resolve of the Indian people. It made it crystal clear that there was no going back. Compromise was no longer an option.
So it kind of backfired on the British in a way.
You could say that it galvanized the population and created this sense of unity and determination that would only grow stronger in the coming years.
And this led to the Quit India movement just a few months later.
Exactly. The Quit India movement, launched in August 1942, was a direct result of the Cripps mission's failure. It was a mass movement demanding an end to British rule, a powerful demonstration of the Indian people's commitment to achieving complete independence.
So a failed mission becomes a catalyst for change. Fascinating how history works sometimes.
It really is. It's a reminder that events often have unintended consequences. And for our UPSC folks out there, this is a perfect example of how to analyze the cause and effect of historical events.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Cripps mission, what are some key takeaways? What should our listeners, especially those preparing for the UPSC exams, really remember?
I think the first big takeaway is that the Cripps mission really highlights the complexity of the Indian independence movement. You've got internal factors, external factors, global power dynamics all converging at this critical juncture.
Right. It wasn't just a simple story of good versus evil or oppressor versus oppressed. It was much more nuanced than that.
Exactly. And the second big takeaway is that the mission's failure, while disappointing at the time, actually ended up pushing India closer to independence.
By uniting the people and solidifying their determination.
Precisely. The Cripps mission, though, a failure, holds a significant place in India's journey to freedom. It exposed the limitations of British concessions and fueled the fire of Indian nationalism, leading ultimately to the realization of complete independence.
Well said. And on that note, we want to thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the Cripps mission. We hope you found it insightful and engaging. Whether you're a history enthusiast or a future civil servant, we encourage you to keep exploring this pivotal period in India's past. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our future deep dives. Until next time,